Issues and Insiders today, we delve into the question of well living as well dying and how prepared the society is for an aging population. So what are the broader implications of an elderly population? Where do we stand on the issue of dying with dignity? And are policies in place to better support a senior society? Hello and welcome. You're watching Issues and Insiders for this Friday. I'm Min Sunhee. A few big screen productions here in this part of the world have been fueling social commentary on the art of aging with grace and the practice of dying with dignity. For more on this, I have Kwon Soa here in the studio. Soa, welcome back.
Hello, Sunny.
I also have Thisanka Siripala live on the line. Thisanka, it's great to have you back.
Thanks for having me on the show again.
Right, so then let's begin with the two movies that I spoke about earlier. Now, one is called Picnic. It's a South Korean production, and the Japanese production, I believe, is called Plan 75. They've been stirring quite a bit of social commentary.
Right. Both movies evolve around elderly people in Korea and Japan, respectively, which happen to be aged or super-aged societies. And they make young and old think about the reality we are facing today. So let's start with Picnic, or 소풍 in Korean, which I watched a few days ago. The film depicts two old women who boast a 6 decades-long friendship that spend time in their hometown they used to live together when they were young. It's heartwarming to see how friends get together after having grown old and how memories are brought back. But the movie also has a sad or a dark tone, and that's actually where many viewers make connections with the reality. For one, it's the very realistic illustration of the physical weakness, pain, and helplessness that seniors face in their last years of life. Also, social conflicts between the younger and older generation, as well as financial difficulties, are dealt with. The ending, which I won't spoil, also lingers long with the audience. Now, the Japanese movie Plan 75 is a dystopian drama in which the government tries to tackle the country's rapidly aging population by creating a program called Plan 75, which is a euthanasia service for people aged 75 and older, regardless of health, so not the common euthanasia that we know of. Elderly citizens are encouraged to sign up to terminate their life in return for cash handouts and funeral services. It's a disturbing idea, but definitely sends a message out. The film raises various problems in society, including the difficulties of continuing work in an old age and not wanting to be a burden to others, which is a very cultural thing in Japan, but also here in Korea. So I think both movies are very relatable for Koreans.
Right, and for some more perspective then, Thisanka, what have been some of the social repercussions of Japan's aging population?
Yes, in Japan, Japan is a rapidly aging society, and one of the biggest issues is poverty among elderly people, and in particular, senior citizens, women over 65, tend to live below, they are more likely to fall below the poverty line. And this is because after losing their husbands or perhaps after a divorce, they tend to have less retirement savings, or they are forced to live on their husband's or their widow's pension. And this can be as low as $460 per month and annually $6,000. And we do see that a lot of women in Japan, they are told to quit their jobs after giving birth and after having a baby, after getting married. And this is also one of the contributors to not having enough money to survive on after retiring.
Right, and before we advance any further, so perhaps you could tell us a bit about how does a country qualify as an aging society, and where does Korea, and for that matter, the rest of the world stand?
Right, so let's first clarify what makes a country an aging society. So according to the United Nations standards, an aging society is defined as one in which at least 7% of the total population is over the age of 65. If those in that age bracket account for 14% of the whole population, it's an aged society. And if the share is at 20% or above, above, that's when we talk about a super-aged society. So now let's take a look at where Korea stands. In 2023, 9.5 million people were aged 65 or above of Korea's total population of 51.5 million. That's 18.4%, but the Ministry of Interior and Safety recently in January put the figure at 19%. So by next year, some 10 million are expected to be elderly. So that's the year Korea should be entering a super-aged society. By 2030, more than a quarter is expected to be part of the elderly age bracket. And then you see the percentage goes up and up. Also notice how the total population declines gradually to below 50 and even 40 million by 2070. And by then, if we do continue to see this trend, close to half of the nation's people will be 65 or older. Now, this phenomenon is a global issue. As of 2021, the number of people aged to 65 or older worldwide stood at 761 million, with the UN projecting that figure to hit 1.6 billion in 2050. But it's happening faster in Korea than anywhere else. For Korea to become a super-aged society from an aged society is likely to take just 7 years. That's faster than the 10 years it took for Japan. Now, making that comparison to estimates for the US, 15 years, the UK, 50 years.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Thisanka, earlier on you spoke about how poverty is a social repercussion suffered by aging women in Japan. Broadly speaking, then, what have been the economic implications of Japan's aging population?
Yeah, so Japan is definitely in the category of a super aging society. More than 35% of the population is over 65. And also, on top of that, 1 in 10 people, that's 10% of the entire population, is over 80. So that's 12 million people that need constant nursing care and medical care. And Japan is grappling with these ballooning, unsustainable healthcare costs. And it's also facing a shrinking labor force. And so, healthcare costs now outstrip medical costs. So a lot of these people, as you age, you tend to need more medical care. And so these people in their 80s, they tend to need constant multiple visits to the doctors. And it is really taking a toll on the economy. And there is a lot of financial burden on younger people to prop up this healthcare system. And also the average yearly cost of giving medical care to someone over 80 is around $6,700 per year, and that is 4 times higher than the price that someone pays if they're under 75. And this trend is extremely alarming, and it is a juggling act for the government to try and rein in this ballooning cost in the next 10 to 20 years.
Right, and perhaps because of the concerns raised by Thisanka, there are critics here in the country, in South Korea as well, who claim that government policies should also focus on supporting the aging society instead of simply focusing on policies to tackle the country's low birth rate, right, So?
Right, Sunny. Although these issues go hand in hand, and which is why there is a presidential committee on aging society and population policy, there appears to be a much bigger governmental focus on dealing with the low birth rate. This, according to experts who say the government's interest in policies for the aging society is not as high as for raising the nation's birth rate, with some suggesting that these two matters should be dealt with separately if they do not create synergy within the same committee. Especially with a high population of elderly and elderly voters ahead of the general elections, supporting the elderly will be necessary. And pressing are especially ways to tackle poverty among the elderly, as Thisanka also mentioned, is the issue in Japan. Korea's elderly poverty rate has been ranking worst among OECD countries in past years. It exceeded 40% in 2023. 2030. And analysts also point out Korea's sharp decline in its potential growth rate, which is forecast to hit the 0% level. In fact, OECD's forecast for Korea's potential growth rate between 2030 and 2060 is 0.8%. And that being similar to Japan's so-called three lost decades, and the Japanese economy also having been impacted heavily on the back of its aging population, among other factors.
Right, of course. Meanwhile, so back on the big screen, you mentioned earlier about how the two movies touch upon, well, with regard to the Korean movie Picnic, it mentions it briefly, I understand, while Plan 75 is about euthanasia. That being said, what is the Korean public sentiment with regard to euthanasia?
Well, while a fictional euthanasia plan was what Plan 75 was all about, as you said, in Picnic, just to quickly mention, the two main characters, with one of them having Parkinson's disease and the other osteoporosis, have a conversation about euthanasia, during which they suggest such policy should be introduced in Korea. And they are not the only ones. Hankuk Research Poll had a survey conducted in 2022, which says 82% of respondents supported the legalization of assisted dying in Korea. 86% of people in their 60s were for that, but even way above 70% among those in their 20s and 30s. And a separate survey by a professor at Seoul National University College of Medicine in the same year said 76% were in favor of making euthanasia legal, and almost 62% were strongly for it. Reasons named were that the rest of life is meaningless, the need for a right to a dignified death, less pain, and less burden on family or society. Of those who opposed, the number one reason was respect for life. Now, in the same survey in 2016, only half of respondents supported euthanasia, so there seems to be a shift in this trend. After long debates, Korea allows patients the removal of life-sustaining devices under strict circumstances, meaning when they are in a vegetative state or when death is imminent, since 2018, but does not allow euthanasia, such as in countries like the Netherlands, where actually just this month, Dries van Agt, former prime minister, and his wife died in a joint act of euthanasia, which is also quite rare in that country, or other countries who allow it are Switzerland, Belgium, Spain, and Canada.
Right, and staying with that, Thisanka, what can you tell us about the public thoughts with regard to euthanasia beyond Korea's borders, perhaps in Japan or elsewhere?
Yes, in Japan, assisted suicide is very much illegal. There's no legal definition for euthanasia, but it does appear to be a very taboo topic. It's controversial. It's not covered extensively in the media here, but there has been a few high-profile cases which has triggered debate on this issue, especially with people with incurable diseases like ALS. And there has been a case where two doctors assisted in a woman with ALS to die with dignity, and they were charged. So it is very much still a criminal matter, and the cases we've seen in Japan, they have been charged.
Right. So as Thisanka mentioned earlier on, that is, healthcare is a big burden for the society as it ages. That being said, I understand there is quite a bit of concern here on the local front as well with regard to the lack of caregivers for the elderly. What more can you tell us?
Exactly. With the growing elderly population, the demand for caregivers and quality care services at nursing hospitals has been growing as well. So by year 2027, a shortfall of 100,000 caregivers is predicted in the country. The Health Ministry announced on Thursday that it will receive applications from nursing hospitals beginning today, this Friday, which want to participate in a pilot program that involves the partial paying of caregiver bills. The project is to start in July this year and should be expanded in stages. This is part of the ministry's plan to reduce the people's financial burden of national care expenses and improve quality of nursing care services at nursing hospitals. The government also had vowed to attract young foreigners to work as caregivers in Korea. One of the measures mentioned back in December is allowing D10 visa holders, which are also known as job seeker visas, to obtain nursing certificates. And once they do hold such qualification, they would be granted an E7 visa or skilled worker visa, which would allow them to work for a longer time in the country as caregivers.
Right, so those are measures taken up by the government here in the country. Thisanka, staying with that, how is Japan seeking to maintain its care support for the elderly then?
Yeah, Japan is facing a similar situation. 70% of nursing homes in Japan are facing a critical shortage of nursing care staff and health workers, and there are plans to recruit more overseas workers. They're easing regulations for nursing care workers. There are programs to learn the Japanese language and then to pass an exam. And there's also more reform to the pension system and the healthcare system. So mid-income and high-income senior citizens will be required to pay out a bit more in their insurance premiums, but these things take, decades to take effect, and so there is a shortage, an immediate shortage now, and we're also seeing problems like neglect, isolation, and with people living alone, and a lot of family structures have also changed in Japan, and a lot of elderly people no longer live with their adult children, and so they do tend to live alone, and it will take some time to see quality of life for elderly people to improve.
Right, and talking about the quality of life for elderly people, Thisanka, this is an impromptu question, but earlier on you spoke about how senior female citizens in Japan face quite a bit of poverty. And that being said, are there any efforts by the government or perhaps by social groups to allow the elderly in Japan to re-enter the workforce, perhaps through job opportunities like barista programs, which some communities here in South Korea have adopted?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the basic pension in Japan is very, very meager. It's around $460 a month, and it's really hard to make ends meet. So we do see this pattern of senior citizens, once they've retired at 65, rejoining the labor force just to supplement their income, doing ad hoc work, cleaning. You see people, retirees, being security staff and cleaners. And it is, a lot of people in this generation are eager to work. They do want to work, but I think it's also a really poor reflection on how you treat elderly people in society, and what's the point of retiring if you still need to work at the end? It's very paradoxical.
Right, and talking about treatment of the elderly, Soa, another concern here in South Korea is the random resentment targeted at the elderly. What countermeasures have been shared?
Yes, I think this is a really sad situation because every young person becomes, not every, but most of young people are going to become elderly people. But yes, Korea ranked second among 15 OECD countries in terms of discrimination against elderly people. Also, crimes against the elderly is a growing concern. The Justice Ministry said that 129,011 crimes against people aged 61 and above happened in 2020. Now, comparing that figure to 5 years before, it was 95,243, which means it's an increase by 35.5%. And I have to mention that the overall number of crimes did not change much during that period. Elderly people are not only easier to target by young people due to their physical weakness, but it appears that hatred towards senior citizens is worsening. And that can be seen in the usage of language also against the elderly. There are newly coined words that look down on elderly people. I looked at some of the words. They were really not familiar to me, but it looks to be a situation that we see online. Now, experts say that the younger generation seems to believe the older generation is of no help to society. There need to be ways to improve the perception of the elderly, is what experts say. And one measure that's being discussed is the way elderly should be called. Now, in Korean, there's the word 노인, but there are alternatives like 선배 시민, which would mean kind of a senior citizen, but not senior as an elderly citizen, but as a person that has more experience in life than you. And it's actually been introduced in Gyeonggi-do province. Now, raising the age that defines someone as elderly person is also being brought up. And that especially as many elderly people or who are currently defined as elderly people still feel fit and young in their 60s, for instance.
So are they thinking of calling a person elderly if they reach the age of 90, perhaps? Hopefully it's one
Maybe
option.
someday,
right?
also because we are living longer.
Right, we really are, we really are. And that being said, we have a few minutes left. So Thisanka, this question to you, again, impromptu. What are your personal thoughts with regard to euthanasia for you personally? If you had the choice, would you take it or would you choose to refrain from it?
I'm not too sure because I think, you know, it really relates to the kind of health condition you have. If you have a debilitating disease or a generative disease, one that's incurable, I think a lot of people with ALS in particular, stories I've read in the media, is that, you know, as soon as you lose a certain function, you know, if you get to a point where I can't speak or express my thoughts, I think that would be, for me personally, it would just be like a loss of my sense of self and my self-worth. So I think in some cases there are young people who are going abroad to do ALS, to die with dignity, but I just don't know what it's like.
It really is a difficult question, right? And it's also a very sensitive matter. I suppose it would depend on the quality of life that you're able to lead, as you said, depending on whether or not you have a disease or not. All right, Thisanka, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And so here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you, Sunny.
Right, and that ends this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend. See you same time next Monday.